Hey, welcome to Hear God's Word. This is Michael Loinger. In this podcast, we study and dissect the Bible to better understand what it means and is trying to say. We'll cover theology and dig into the original meaning through language and word studies. We'll even discuss scientific and historical ties, but we'll always come back to the basics. There's so many layers to the Bible, and it's all important. So, if you want to hear what God has to say, then let's dive in. All right, I'm excited to be jumping back into God's Word with you guys. And we're going to be picking up in chapter 24. We've been talking about Abraham's servant who ends up going to the land of Nahor, otherwise known as Aram Naharaim, and he's trying to find a wife for Isaac. Again, this is one of my favorite side stories in the Bible because, in one sense, it's part of the main plot, but at the same time, it is kind of off to the side. It transitions the story, in one sense, from Abraham to Isaac and his future wife. And we already have met the young, dazzling woman, and her name is Rebecca. And we learned last week that she's the daughter of Bethuel and Milcah, but we know that Bethuel is Nahor's son, and Nahor is brothers with Abraham. I wanted to start off by going back from verse 12 through 14 again real quick, though. We're kind of doing some backtracking because this is important. A lot of times, the story that you're about to read or the part of the chapter, you need to link it back to what was said earlier because otherwise you miss something huge that was happening. It's almost like in modern days where a man will ask his girlfriend's dad if he's okay and has the blessing to be able to marry his daughter. And so if you knew this information ahead of time, you're just waiting and expecting for something to happen. And it's the same thing when the servant is asking God to show up and to put the right person in front of him. Let's take a look at some of the things he said again. We've talked about this concept of God giving him success and being loyal and faithful to his family. But we also see that in verse 13, he says, hey God, I'm standing right here by this spring, and I know the daughters of the town, like all the ladies, all the young ladies, are about to come out and draw some water. So the servant in verse 14 says that he's asking or going to ask, hey, please, can you let down your jar so that I can have something to drink? And then, like, he's coming up with all these expectations for God to come through with. And of course, the woman is going to have to be the one to come through and to be in sync with God. But on top of asking for some drink for himself, he's asking for his 10 camels to also get something to drink. If a woman's willing to serve 10 camels, which could probably drink quite a bit, that, she's a winner right there if she's willing to help with that. And he says that these are the two ways, basically, that he's looking for in order to see whether or not God is in it. And he wants to know which person God's chosen. So he's looking also for some qualities himself. He's looking for someone who's going to be kind to him because he's going to be part of their family and bring the lovely lady back. So she better be willing to do something kind to his servant, and also even for his possessions, the camels. And so a wife that can take care of a person and the family possessions, that's a winner right there. But he's asking, hey, God, I need you to come through and help me find the right woman. So, as we talked about, even though he doesn't know that Rebecca is Rebecca yet, when it says it in verse 15, it's basically 2020 sight where obviously the author knows what's coming in the story and who he met, which is Rebecca, son of Bethuel, as we were talking about, which is a relative from the family of Nahor. But we also see something interesting. We see in verse 16, starting now, it says, "The woman was very beautiful, a virgin. No man had ever slept with her. She went down to the spring, filled her jar, and came up again." So we're learning some things about her. We see that it says, number one, that she is beautiful. So I think the servant is obviously trying to find someone who's attractive for his master's son. And it also says she's a young woman. So this also plays into the fact that it says she is a virgin. And not only does it say she's beautiful, she's young and beautiful, she's a virgin. And it's not only explicit about her being a virgin, but it clarifies the details. It says no one had known her. If you pay attention to the biblical language earlier, you know that this is basically a euphemism for to have sex. So obviously, if she's a virgin, it's just being super obvious and clarifying something we really need to know, which is that she is a virgin. She hasn't had sex with anyone and hasn't slept with another man. This was an important key for them, especially back then. And even nowadays, it's still a valuable thing when you can find someone who has not had sex with other people. The chances of them being faithful to you because they actually have values and morals and are waiting for the right person, it makes the relationship so much more reliable as opposed to someone who has low values and just easily gives themselves away and sleeps around. They devalue themselves as well as their family and also the future person that they actually will end up being with. They give a part of themselves away, and it was definitely disgraceful to your family because your family had to find someone good to marry you off to. And if they're like, yeah, my daughter has no restraint, she just goes and finds men, then the family would be like, okay, well, we don't want someone who is not going to be a reliable spouse for our son. So we're going to move on, And obviously, vice versa would go as well, but especially for a lady at that time, it could have even been punishable upon death. But since she is a virgin, there's no problems. So we see that God is already lining things up. He's brought someone from the family. He's brought someone who's a virgin. And those are the two prerequisites that the servant didn't even talk about. Like, God, I need a beautiful woman for my servant's son. Obviously she needs to be a virgin. my master said it has to be from his family, so please, let this line up. But he doesn't even ask those things. He does ask a few things which are actually coming up. First, she starts getting some water and doesn't seem to notice the servant, because why would she? He's just a random stranger just standing around at the moment. But then we see in verse 17, the servant is already on to this woman, and he sees some potential in her. So it says that he runs, or he hurries over to meet her as soon as she comes back up for water. And he's testing her out right here. He's like, "Ooh, beautiful woman. Looks like probably a virgin." And we're going to talk about that in just a minute, because there's actually a sign in that culture that could show whether or not someone probably was married or not married or engaged. So let's talk about that in just a few. But first, what does he do? He asks her for what he was asking God. He says, "Hey, can I get something to drink?" And so she gives him a little bit of water. And so, check mark number one, she's very kind and thoughtful, and without even any hesitation is just hospitable and generous. These are the kind of qualities that the servant is looking for. And then she goes on and adds in verse 18, she tells him to drink, and it even uses and adds the word quickly. This is showing that she's serious. She responds quickly to the needs around her, which is a great quality. So then we jump into verse 19, and it says, when she finished giving him a drink, then she said, "Hey, let me get some for your camels too." What was the servant asking earlier in the prayer, like we were talking about? When he was talking with God, he said, "Let her give me a drink, and let her give my camels a drink as well." He didn't even ask. He goes up and he starts initiating the request. But we see here that the servant doesn't even ask for his camels to get a drink, but Rebecca herself takes the initiative to do this. And I don't know if maybe she kind of sniffed something in the air and she's like, this seems like this doesn't happen every day, where a stranger with 10 camels comes by asking me for stuff, and he's carrying quite a bit of items, and there might be something interesting going on here. So I better show this guy some extra hospitality, because it might come in handy. So I don't know if Rebecca maybe could smell in the air that this guy was either maybe a father who was looking for a good young woman, and Rebecca was reacting according to maybe her instincts, or if she just was completely oblivious and she was just willing to do this out of the blue for a stranger. Again, getting water for 10 camels is no easy feat. And of course, she's probably not going to be able to fully hydrate the camels to the full amount that they could end up taking. But the fact that she gives all of the camels some to drink, that had to have taken more than a few minutes for her to have done that. And we know that the day was winding down. And so as the day is winding down, it says that she was giving them drink until she had finished. And so then it says she quickly emptied her jar and she ran back to the well to draw some more water for all the camels. And so she's obviously working herself to sweat, and then we see in verse 21, the servant slash, it says here, the man was just, it says gazing or basically watching her. He was paying attention and looking for details. He was observing her. And again, we don't know if she knew that she was purposely being observed for a very special reason, of course, as we know. But it says that he remained silent and he was quiet so that he could know whether or not God was going to prosper and make this trip effective. And we can see so far, it looks like she's fulfilling both of the criteria that he was praying for. Literally, the first woman he saw, the first woman he interacted with. And that's what this term, like success or prosper, means here. That he was basically observing and waiting to see if God, it says Yahweh, like the Lord, was going to prosper his journey or not. Because what if she stops in the middle or she starts having a bad attitude? Well, he might have to reconsider, even though she's went so far already. But he's also waiting on God and being patient because he wants to make sure and see all of the quality of this woman. And he wants to see if she follows everything to a T. And he also wants to pay attention because he asked God, like, this is the sign I'm looking for. If he looks the other way and then misses something, then he might not be able to judge whether or not God actually is blessing and initiating this interaction. So then we see she finishes with the camels, and the man, the servant, he takes a golden ring of a half shekel and 2 bracelets for her wrists of 10 shekels of gold. And so shekels are a weight amount, but the specific ring, a nazem, is actually a nose ring. And in addition, it often was kind of like, in a way, a pre-engagement ring. And so he sees maybe that she doesn't have one on her nose, because that would be a sign that she's married. And also the jewelry around her wrist as well. She probably didn't have either any, or she didn't have any of the certain kind that would indicate that she's a taken woman. And of course, he doesn't know if she's a virgin off the bat, but he's trusting and he's seeing the signs. And that's why he's probably also paying attention. Because remember, like we were talking about earlier, we're going to come back around to this. He's paying attention, and just like in our culture, you can look at someone's left hand on their ring finger and see if they have a ring on there. And that's a pretty good indicator usually if someone is either engaged or married. And so if you see something on there, you ain't going to be like, hey there, you're going to let that person pass and you're going to wait for someone, unless you're just a scumbag. But anyways, I could talk about that all day. I have a lot of trauma related to that topic, but for the sake of staying on topic with what God specifically is saying in his word here and what the Bible is trying to communicate, we're going to move on. And a shekel, when we're talking about all of this jewelry, is nothing cheap. It definitely is, and the fact that it's gold as well, is saying, hey, me giving you these things, she knows now at this point that, oh yeah, like, either this is the father of someone who wants me to marry their son, or a servant came for their master and they have a son who they want me to meet and be engaged to. And so she knows now at this point, if she didn't before, that she's essentially being asked or starting the process of maybe finding a husband. And so receiving these kinds of gifts, no one just brings random gifts like this. Like, this wasn't just a, hey, thank you so much for giving me some water. I'm just a traveler in town. Here's all of these fancy nose rings and bracelets for your wrist. Here's, 10 shekels of golden rings and bracelets and all of this jewelry. This is obviously a sign of proposal in a way. And so he finds someone who literally met all the criteria that he was asking God for. And so he wanted to lock in on her right away because he saw that God was choosing this woman. And it seems so clear and obvious by the story that God wanted everything to work out here, and every step of the process ended up working, even though Rebecca didn't know what she was going to find at the well, an encounter. And like we were talking about, this is a place of encounter. The servant went there to find a woman, and we see that the woman, Rebecca, goes just on an ordinary evening trip to go get some water. And here she finds probably the best thing that she could ever ask for in her life. And that's finding a good husband. Of course, not everything is set in stone right now, so we have to keep reading. But in verse 23, and we'll end on this, he asks whose daughter she is. And earlier we found out, but he's finding out for the first time. And then he also asks if there's room in her father's home so that he can lodge or spend the night. And so she tells him that she's the daughter of Bethuel, and Bethuel's parents were Nahor and Milcah. And we know Nahor is family. And so the servant is ecstatic because he now knows that he's found exactly the right person. Like, all of these questions, all of these observations, all of these gifts, like, he has to pull the plug and lock in on her, because who knows, maybe Joseph was waiting and was going to have his parents offer a dowry and propose to her on her way back that night or the next day. She's a young, attractive woman. She's not going to be available for too much longer in their village. And so the servant made a smart decision. As soon as all of the criteria were met, as soon as he saw this was clearly from God, he's like, all right, got to make the decision. There's also one other thing I wanted to mention, which is the fact that technically he hasn't even talked to the father yet. Remember, like I was talking earlier, it's kind of like telling the father of the woman that you're dating that you got engaged or proposed, but you tell him after doing so. Obviously, it's a little more risky, especially if doesn't even know who the person is, but the servant obviously sees that God's hand is in this, and he's taking a step of faith by offering her all these things. Because what if he just gave all of his jewelry to a woman who's going to take it, and then she's going to keep it, and then he ends up getting turned away empty-handed? You know, he's not going to ask for the jewelry back, most likely. So he would obviously be screwed, and he'd have to go back to Abraham and Isaac and say, sorry, I really messed up. I jumped the gun and gave all the stuff to a woman, and then the family didn't accept the offer. So we see here that he is having some trust in God and that this is the right person. And so we also know that he's going to go over and meet with the father. At least he's asking to do so. But we're going to pick up on that next time. Hey, I'm so glad you guys could join for today's podcast. I hope things clicked for you and that you're able to better understand God's word. Jesus said, whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. So keep on listening to what God has to say, and I'll see you guys next time. God bless.